Right, good afternoon, everyone. It's Loane Sharp here, Adcorp's labour economist. So, I am an economist by training, but I specialise in issues affecting the labour market in South Africa. So, today we're going to take a tour of many aspects of the labour market, some of which are topical, some of which will become topical, I think, in the next year. But we're going to cover a whole range of things from skills shortages to unionisation and perhaps even industrial action. So, the first slide I have, which numerically for you in the bottom left of the slides would be slide number 3, is that unemployment is South Africa's major challenge. There's no question about it. Problems that you identify, like crime and social grants and all sorts of issues, link back to the fact that people don't have jobs. So if we look at the first point, in 1994, the unemployment rate in South Africa was about 13%. It wasn't measured in the same way that it is today, but the unemployment rate today is 37%, meaning that 37% of people available and willing to work are unemployed. So post-apartheid South Africa's biggest disappointment is the economy's failure to create jobs. Just to give you some of the statistics, the labor force, meaning people available for work, is about 17 million. Of that, about 13 million are formally employed. We break that down, 4.4 million South Africans are unemployed. A further 2 million are permanently discouraged about ever finding work. And a further 2.1 million people are underemployed, meaning they are available to work more hours than they currently are. 2.7 million of the unemployed have been out of work for more than a year. Nearly half of the economically active population is idle, and a staggering proportion, nearly 3/4, of unemployed people are under the age of 24. So it doesn't matter how you look at it, unemployment is South Africa's most pressing socio-economic problem. Interestingly, who are the unemployed? They are youth. 82% are under the age of 35, 75% are Black African, and 51% have never worked in their lives before. So the big challenge in South Africa is how to get people leaving a very poor secondary schooling system and getting them into their first job, on which so much of their careers depends. If we look at the next slide, which is numbered 4 in the bottom left corner, we produce at Adcorp a monthly employment index. This index is different from the data supplied by the government, by Stats SA. And if there's time at the end of the presentation, I'll go into what the controversies have been between Adcorp and Stats SA in terms of what is occurring in the employment environment. So this is our take on employment. You can see that between 2001 and 2009, there was a dramatic increase in the number of people employed. That was largely associated with boom times in the financial services and technology sectors. And then, unfortunately, in 2009, the party came to an end, and over about 7 months, the economy lost nearly 1 million jobs. And since that time, we've been struggling to get those jobs back. We're nowhere near the levels that we observed prior to the 2009 recession. In the next slide, slide 5, I've broken down the Adcorp Employment Index into 2 different categories. The red on the left is typical employment, what we call standard, permanent, 9 to 5, weekends off, standard types of employment. And the chart on the right in green shows atypical employment. These are temporary, part-time, contract, and other workers. Now, what you can see is that typical employment, standard permanent jobs, have been on the decline since about 2000. And in fact, permanent employment in South Africa is at the lowest point it's ever been in the history available to us. Atypical employment, on the other hand, has been growing significantly since 2000. In fact, it's the only part of the labor market that is growing and creating jobs. We're going to look at some of the reasons behind these trends, why permanent employment is in decline and temporary employment is on the rise. But just to give you a sense of the numbers, there are 13 odd million people employed in South Africa. 3 million of those are employed by the government, leaving about 10 million people employed in the private sector. Of those 10 million, 4 million are temps, and of those 4 million, 1 million are agency temps, meaning that they're employed through temporary employment agencies. If I look at the next slide, slide 6, this really comes to the heart of our problems in South Africa. This is a chart showing economic activity in blue and employment in red since the early 1940s. And you can see that from 1940 to the mid-1990s, the economy and employment moved very much together. As the economy grew, jobs were created. And then in the mid-1990s, that relationship broke down. The economy powered ahead. The South African economy's done actually very well by most people's standards and expectations, but employment has fallen away. So in fact, employment today is lower in the private sector than it was in the late 1980s. So employment is going nowhere even as the economy grows, and this has given us the problem of jobless growth, economic growth that doesn't translate into job creation. We're going to look at some of the causes behind that. But before we do that, let's look at a couple of other aspects of the South African labor market. The first, and I think probably what you encounter in your environments on a daily basis, is the tremendous shortage of skills. On slide 7, in the table on the left-hand side, we've got different occupations and then the amount of skills shortages, which are positive figures, and skills surpluses, which are negative figures. So you can see that South Africa has a surplus of elementary workers and domestic workers. These are people who have no skills, really. And we have a shortage of all other occupations. Now, it's interesting to note that the top 3 categories, management, professionals, and technicians, account for the vast majority of skills shortages in South Africa. I'm often asked to give study advice to young people who want to find work in South Africa. And my advice is usually this. If you're in the top 5% of academic performance, then you can't do any better than going into one of the professions. And by the professions, I mean medicine, law, accounting, finance, and engineering. Those are the professions. And if you're in the top academic performers in the country, then really professional qualifications are for you. You'll make a very good living, as you see in the chart on the right. In the chart on the right of slide 7, these are after inflation wages for skilled workers in the country. You can see that since 1997, skilled workers' remuneration has been rising dramatically, particularly after the Immigrations Act was passed in 2002. What that Immigrations Act did was it made foreigners very difficult to employ in the South African labor market. And what that meant was, in the absence of competition from foreign high-skilled workers, South Africa's become a hotbed for skilled workers, and skilled wages have been rising dramatically over and above the level of inflation. So, my first piece of advice is if you have the academic credentials, go into one of the professions. If you don't have the academic capabilities or achievements, then the next best thing to go into in South Africa is management. There is a tremendous shortage of junior, middle, and senior management in South Africa. And what that means for a young person is to do a tertiary qualification in management, which exposes you to various functions like marketing, finance, and human resources. And then try and find a supervisory position as soon as you can. It doesn't matter which industry, but if you develop your skills as a manager, you'll very quickly, in whatever industry you choose, you'll very quickly be promoted. So that's the story of skills shortages. The next slide I want to look at is the use of labor versus the use of capital. Remember, labor and capital are substitutes in the production process, which means that you can either use more labor or more capital or some combination of the two to produce the things that you produce. Capital includes equipment, plant, machinery, technology, automation, software, and the like. And labor is really just the raw human power in terms of the number of hours worked. You can see in this chart here that since 1962, the usage of labor in South Africa has dramatically declined, whereas the usage of capital has risen significantly. In other words, South African employers overall are using fewer people and more machinery in the production process. So just to give you an example, you might have heard some of the Anglo-American advertisements on radio and TV. One of those advertisements was an advertisement for Amplatz, Anglo-American's platinum business, where they indicated that over the next few years they'd be spending 6 billion rand, 6,000 million rand, in upgrading their facilities around Rustenburg in the Platinum Belt. What was amazing about this announcement was that for a 6 billion rand investment, they would only create 500 sustainable jobs. And that tells you, just by way of an anecdote, how much more important capital has become in the mix of production relative to labor. If we look at the next slide, you can understand why. In slide 9, we've got labor versus capital productivity. And you can see that for the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s, labor productivity in South Africa has been declining, whereas capital productivity has been rising. Currently, in the 2000s, if you employ an extra worker, production doesn't go up, it goes down, which is a really staggering result to think about. Why would you employ more people if those people interfere with the production process? So in the chart on the right, we've got capital productivity, which is a dramatic case for the use of automation and mechanization. The next slide, slide 10, shows something that's very much on everybody's tongues, which is affirmative action, which we euphemistically call employment equity in South Africa. In the chart on the left, you can see the number of high-income black South Africans. What is a high-income black South African? Someone who earns more than the average white South African. You can see that in the year 2000, there were just 200,000 high-income blacks. By 2011, that had increased to nearly 1.4 million. So this is an incredibly positive story. It's a story about the emergence of the black middle class. So the black middle class is growing dramatically. Unfortunately, 40% of this increase is in the government sector, in the public service. So mostly government is being used, the government payroll is being used to boost incomes of black South Africans. You can see in the chart on the right, the average income of a black South African as a percentage of the average white South African has increased from just 15% to nearly 45% at the moment. What this implies is that over the next 10 years, income disparities between black and white South Africans will disappear. They will disappear not only because white incomes are not rising very fast, they will disappear because more and more black people are becoming skilled in the labor market. And additional skills brings higher incomes. If we look at the next slide, slide 11, this is something that is of great interest to people watching the labor market, which is declining union membership. You can see in the chart on the left that union membership is quite volatile, and unions know this. They know that one of the first things employees give up when economic times are tough is the 760 Rand they pay to their unions a year. So unionization is very volatile, but gradually, steadily, it's been declining. It's declined from 31% to about 28% at present. You can see unionization is very different by sector. The highest level of unionization occurs in mining and quarrying. The mines are heavily unionized. You'll notice that electricity and transport are also heavily unionized. Those are the effects of Eskom and Transnet. And then finally, you'll notice that community services, which is really government, unionization is high. It's staggering to think, but at the moment, there are more union members in the government sector than in the entire private sector combined. So more and more unions in South Africa are representing civil servants. And it's important to understand trade unions' constituency, the people they aim to appeal to in the labor market. One of the results of declining union membership is that strike-related violence and intimidation has increased. You can see on the chart on the right, intimidation-related absenteeism has increased many times since 2008. Violence, unrest, or intimidation is now the fourth biggest cause of absenteeism in the South African economy. You can see in the chart on the left exactly why this is occurring. Strike participation rates are very low. So even when a union calls a strike, the percentage of union members who show up on that strike is very low. The highest it ever was in recent history was 9%, when 9% of union members showed out on the municipal workers' strike in 2010. But in general, strike participation is between 1 and 3%, meaning only 1 to 3% of union members actually show up on a strike. And of course, that's why violence and intimidation related to strikes is increasing. Fewer strikes are being called. Union members are participating less in strike activity, and union members are responding by intimidating workers to participate in the strike. So another trend that I think is interesting on slide 13 is that large numbers of people are migrating to the informal sector. You can see in the chart on the left, which shows the number of people running their own businesses. Between 2001 and 2006, the number increased from 2 million to about 2.4 million. And then from 2006 to 2011, the number of people running their own businesses declined by about 440,000. Now, the question that occurs to me is, have these businesses really ceased operating, or are they just not reporting themselves to the authorities? And there's a lot of evidence, some of which I will go through, that businesses are disappearing into the informal sector. Remember, 2/3 of total employment occurs in companies employing less than 50 people. And nearly 50% of total employment occurs in companies employing less than 5 people. So small businesses are the job creators in an economy. And it should be worrying to us that 440,000 businesses have either disappeared or disappeared into the informal sector. You can see in the chart on the right the number of people trying to start their own businesses. At any point in time in 2001, it was about 250,000 people. That's dropped way down. Only 50,000 people at present are trying to start their own businesses, which is 1/5 of the level, only 20% of the level in 2001. Now, again, I don't think this means that small businesses are disappearing. I think that they are dropping out of the formal economy into the informal sector. We have a myth in South Africa that the informal sector is primarily spaza shop owners, hair and beauty and personal care services, transport in townships, and things like that. I think it's largely a myth. The informal sector in South Africa consists of solid businesses who are evading income taxes and flouting labor laws and regulations. So I think labor laws and regulations and income taxes are the reasons why businesses are disappearing into the informal economy where they don't pay taxes or observe labor laws. That brings us into conflict with Statistics South Africa or Stats SA. You might have seen some of the controversy recorded in the press. We've had lots of media exposure around the discrepancies between Stats SA and Adcorp's estimates of employment. So what I've got here on slide 14 is a list of variables, about 20 of them. And I've shown in two columns the estimate produced by Stats SA and the actual verified figures. So for example, if you just take the first line, Stats SA tells us there are 7.2 million taxpayers. This is their estimate. But we don't need to estimate it. We can go to SARS and ask SARS how many taxpayers there actually are. And SARS says to us there are nearly 8 million taxpayers. So where are the missing 750,000 taxpayers? Why does Stats SA undercount the number of taxpayers that there actually are? You can look at the second line, the number of business owners. Stats SA tells us there are just short of 2 million. The Business Trust tells us there are 5.6 million. And so on and so forth. In every one of these variables, Stats SA undercounts the actual verified figure that is known to us. And the average undercount is about 25%. What this means is that Stats SA probably does a good job of capturing formal sector employment, employment that happens in companies that are registered with the authorities. It also means probably that Stats SA does less good a job at measuring and estimating the number of informal companies and informal sector employees in the country. What this means as a bottom line is that the unemployment rate that we've been fed by Stats SA of about 25% is probably very high. It's probably higher than the reality indicates. If we make adjustments, as we do at Adcorp, for the number of people who are probably working in the informal sector, South Africa's unemployment rate is closer to 11% than 25%. Still not something to be proud of, but much lower than the authorities would like us to believe. And if we have time, I'd be happy to go through with you why I think the authorities have a vested interest in getting these figures wrong. What I'm going to show you for now is two ways that we can validate Adcorp's assumptions about the informal sector. The first, on slide 15, is the so-called cash economy. Now, you will know that banks in South Africa are desperately trying to discourage people from using cash. Cash is expensive for banks to hold. Cash is expensive to transport securely. Cash heists are a major risk and temptation even to bank employees. So banks are trying to reduce the use of cash in the economy. But what's actually happening is the use of cash is growing dramatically. And it's been growing especially since the Labour Relations Act was introduced in 1995. You can see that before 1995, banknotes in circulation in the economy very closely matched the amount of expenditure in the economy, which makes sense because over that time frame, people used cash for transactions. But since 1995, the use of cash has dramatically exceeded the amount of expenditure in the economy. Now, why is this? Why is cash use growing when all the banks are putting in so many investments into reducing the use of cash? Well, our view at Adcorp is that the cash economy is growing because the informal sector is growing. And there are clever statistical methods you can use to extract the number of people employed in the informal sector by reversing out of these cash figures the amount of economic activity that is not being reported to the authorities. Here again, we find the unemployment rate is much lower in South Africa than the authorities suggest, roughly 15% rather than 25%. Now, if I can just stop for a second, why would the Labour Relations Act, which was introduced in 1995, have such a powerful effect on the cash economy? Well, you might have heard us at Adcorp. We often write in the Business Day and the Financial Mail, and we often interviewed senior executives at Adcorp, interviewed for our views on the labour market. And you will hear that many of us are concerned about the high levels of regulation of the labour market. Now, this doesn't mean we want to throw out all labour laws and regulations. It means we want to reform those labour laws and regulations that inhibit employment. And I think there are two primary areas of labour law that had unintended negative effects on employment. The first aspect or part of the law is dismissal protections. You will probably experience in your environments the difficulties associated with dismissing someone for poor work performance. And in fact, if you look at the Labour Relations Act, there is no special category of dismissal for poor work performance. There's dismissal for incapacity, meaning you don't possess the innate attributes needed to do the job. And there's dismissal for misconduct, meaning that you disobeyed an instruction, a valid instruction. But there's no special category for poor work performance. And in many companies and many industries, and especially in the public sector, these dismissal protections have been taken to an extreme point where people show up at work with no fear that if they don't perform, they can be sanctioned. This is not to say every company has this, but you can imagine small companies that don't have HR departments, that don't have performance measures and policies and procedures. You can imagine how difficult it is for small business owners and small employers to discipline workers for poor work performance. So we need to introduce a category of dismissal that strikes the right balance between the need for security of employees and the need of productivity of companies. The second aspect or part of labor laws that is problematic is collective bargaining. You will no doubt be aware in wage negotiations in your respective companies, you will be aware that wage increases consistently range between 7 and 11%. Now, bear in mind the economy is currently going through its weakest period in 20 years. The global financial crisis that has hit the world is the biggest crisis in 80 years. So it seems strange that the economy is in desperate trouble, but workers are demanding wages of exactly the same kind that they were asking for 4 and 5 years ago in very different economic circumstances. Now, the reason for this, I think, is collective bargaining, and especially collective bargaining at the sector level. What would normally be ideal is that you have collective bargaining at the workplace level. So let's take two companies, Standard Bank and First National Bank. Let's say Standard Bank is performing poorly and FNB is performing well. Well, FNB's good performance should be reflected in higher wage increases for their workforce. And in our hypothetical example, Standard Bank's weaker performance should be reflected in lower wage increases. But what we have at the moment is that for entire industry sectors, and in some cases for the entire economy, we're giving wage increases that pay no attention at all to the condition, the economic vitality of individual enterprises. So those two things, dismissal protections and sector-level bargaining, have, I think, caused enormous damage in small businesses, which explains, in my mind, why small businesses are disappearing into the informal sector. Another thing on slide 16, the light economy, this is another way that we can test Adcorp's assumption that we're underestimating employment. In the chart on the left, you've got a scatter plot. And let me just explain what those dots mean. On the vertical axis, we've got GDP, which is a measure of the country's income. And on the horizontal axis, we've got a measure of light intensity, also called luminosity for individual countries. Now, there should be a close link. The higher the income of a country, the more light that country should emit to weather satellites that are circling the globe. What's in fact happening is that in some countries, there's a whole lot more light being emitted at night as detected by these satellites than the authorities suggest. And it's interesting here in the chart on the right that South Africa probably has 15 to 20% higher income than the authorities are measuring. And again, as I say, the authorities are probably measuring things well in the formal sector. They're probably measuring things poorly in the informal sector. So that's really my story. I know that we've covered an enormous amount of ground. And what I would like to do is open up to your questions. So Hazel asks the question that she's interested in scarce skills. What skills are scarce? I did cover this, but it's worth repeating, especially if you have young people that you need to give advice to. If you have the academic capabilities, go into one of the professions: medicine, law, accounting, finance, or engineering. And if you don't have the academic credentials, get a diploma in management and the basic management functions of finance, HR, marketing, and so on. And get yourself into a supervisory role as soon as possible. You will have a very good career if you follow that advice. Michael asks the question, do you have a graph which matches employment from slide? I'm not entirely sure what that means. Peter asks the question, which I can't read for now. Francois asks the question, would capital productivity include outsourced labor? That's a very good question, because one of the reasons why labor productivity is poor in South Africa is that there are no clear links between pay and productivity. South Africa scores very poorly on the linkages between pay and productivity. The one exception to that rule or that observation is the use of outsourced workers. Outsourced workers are typically not paid a fixed salary. They're paid on the basis of the number of hours they work. Look, still, the number of hours is not the ideal way to remunerate someone. Ideally, you want to be remunerating them for their direct contribution to your business goals. So, no, capital productivity doesn't include outsourced labor. Outsourced labor is included in the labor productivity stats. We made adjustments for that. That's an answer to Francis' question. Olivia's asked the question, what is your view on having a sunset clause for affirmative action? Should income disparities between affirmative action and non-affirmative action candidates disappear? Well, I think we are going to have that. We're going to have, in the next 10 years, we're going to have convergence between especially black and white incomes. White incomes are only rising at 4.6% per annum, and black incomes are rising at 12.3% per annum. It doesn't take many years with that disparity for income differences to disappear. Unfortunately, it's a political question of whether employment equity legislation will ever reflect those realities. And probably, as with many countries around the world, we're going to observe affirmative action laws remain in place long after they've ceased to make sense. Peter asks, are the slides available? Yes, they are most definitely available. I'm going to give you my email address, which is loan@adcorp.co.za. Loan is spelled like a loan from a bank with an E at the end, Loane. at adcorp.co.za, and you're welcome to write to me. Not only would I be very happy to send you the slides, but I'd also be very happy to include you on our free distribution list for research, which is produced monthly. We look at one or other aspect of the labor market in a bit of depth every month, and we publish that on the closest business day to the 10th of the month. So again, my email address, Loane, Loane, at adcorp.co.za. Olivia asks, would you say the decline in small businesses means that enterprise development is not working? I think that's exactly what I conclude. Most of what I observe in terms of enterprise development is that it's done mechanically, simply to meet scorecard criteria rather than to make any real contribution. I'm very skeptical of artificial mechanisms like affirmative action, enterprise development, Black economic empowerment. I'm very skeptical that those nice sounding measures have a real impact at the end of the day. Bernard Wakeford asks, what's your view on the impact of the youth wage subsidy? I'm not a fan of the youth wage subsidy. I think the Treasury itself, when it produced the recommendation to introduce a youth wage subsidy, the Treasury indicated that no more than 150,000 jobs would be created. So the youth wage subsidy is not going to be a large-scale job creation initiative. But what the value is of the youth wage subsidy is that once and for all, it will demonstrate the importance that wages have and wage levels have to employment in South Africa. There is a movement of people, particularly in the trade union movement, who believe that wages have no impact, and especially that wage escalations have no impact on employment, which I think is wrong. So the youth wage subsidy, I think, will give us a clear indication that lower wages for youth will encourage youth employment, and we can learn valuable national lessons from that experience. But unfortunately, I think it's true as far as unions are concerned that the youth wage subsidy will really involve substitution between younger and older workers. Amos asks the question, any chance that labor regulations will change in the near future? The short answer is there's no way, there's no chance at all. Look, South Africa is unusual because we are making labor laws more restrictive at a time when in the rest of the world, the trend is toward deregulation of labor markets. But in South Africa, we have this unfortunate political alliance between the ANC and COSATU. And as a result of that alliance, certain reforms that are much needed are turned down or resisted by COSATU. Michael asks the question, or says that he's keen to understand the level of employment opportunities versus the number of new entrants entering the labor market. Well, every year, the schooling system throws out about 500,000 people who then go on to look for work. Now, according to our modeling, the economy needs to grow 4% per annum just to absorb those 500,000. And the economy needs to grow 9% per annum to make substantial inroads into at least our formal sector unemployment problem. So Yeah, the unfortunate thing is uh, the labor market in South Africa is very messy. At the same time that we've got 830,000 vacancies that we could fill immediately if only the skills were available, we've got nearly 600,000 unemployed graduates and diplomats, people who've emerged from the tertiary education system with the wrong qualifications. Um, the next question is again from Michael. Can we survive with continued salary increases above inflation levels? Don't we become uncompetitive? The reality is we do. All an economist can do is illustrate the trade offs, the consequences that will occur of doing one thing rather than another. Yes, you can raise wages indefinitely, but you must realize that there will be unemployment consequences. And you can reduce wage levels if you want to promote employment. But then you must realize there's going to be a political backlash from COSATU. So I think we could survive most things. I mean, if you look in South Africa, as a result of minimum wages in the agricultural sector, employment in agriculture over the last 30 years has fallen from 2.2 million to just 600,000. Over the same period, employment in mining has gone from 1.4 million to 520,000. So, yes, we do survive, but ultimately, above inflation wage increases lead to unemployment. And then finally, from Shimmy, are young people joining the marketplace also joining unions? So this is a great question. The average age of a union member in South Africa is 43, and the average age of a job seeker is 24. So that immediately tells you that young people have a completely different attitude to the world of work. Unlike their parents, who are unionized overwhelmingly, young people want to be paid for their personal performance. They don't want company-wide increases. In order to retain young people today, you have to personalize their pay and work schedules and career opportunities. So I think the days of trade unions having a monopoly on workplace relations are coming to an end. And it's interesting, if you monitor trade unions in any great degree of detail as I do, you'll notice that trade unions are very well aware of their crisis of relevance. What's basically happening in the trade union movement is that trade unions are offering their members more and more benefits, like financial services, commuter insurance, funeral cover, bursary schemes for union members' children, all sorts of pension and provident funds. Unions are very well aware of declining membership, particularly among young people. And to some extent, that's why unions want to keep young people out of the workplace. That's why COSATU opposes the youth wage subsidy. Anyway, there's probably more than enough material here to have many webinars. Thank you very much for your participation and attendance. And don't forget, you can get a copy of the slides from me, or you can join our distribution list for research every month at loan@adcorp.co.za.